this is the Provoked Prawn, and here I'm revisiting the NZXT H510 Flow. Now, I did a previous build guide on this case where I talked about the various highlights of it and I showed off the features, and I went into depth on a build process for it. The end result being that I built it with a 240mm radiator with a push-pull setup on the front and then two RGB fans at the top and rear as well, and you can see that in all its glory here. But NZXT accidentally sent me two of these cases, exactly the same case twice, so I thought it might be fun to do a completely different video where instead of using an all-in-one cooler and RGB, I went for a much more straightforward build which focuses exclusively on air. So now I'm using Corsair's AF120 Elite fans, as well as a CPU tower cooler from Deepcool, and I've done videos on both those things separately that I'll link to in the description. I've also got a slightly different setup, so the specs of this are ever so slightly different. For example, it uses an NZXT N7 Z590 motherboard and an Intel Core i7-11700K in this build. And as you can see, it looks the part and quite interesting because I've obviously got quite a black and white theme going on here. And there is very minimal RGB. In fact, the only RGB on this build is in the Kingston HyperX Fury Beast RAM, which has some RGB lighting on it, which we'll see ever so slightly at the end. So in this video, I'm going to talk briefly about the highlights of this build and the things that were interesting and different about building like this versus building with the RGB. The H510 Flow is a relatively affordable, reasonably easy to build in case, which is relatively fuss-free and surprisingly good in a number of different ways. Obviously, the flow is the main part here with the airflow up front, so it has a front panel on it which has a lot of air potential in it. It comes with just two fans as standard. Now, theoretically, for what I'm doing, I possibly could have mounted both those fans on the front and then use the CPU tower cooler to just exhaust the air through, because it would naturally pull it through the tower cooler, because that cooler, as you will see, has two fans on it as standard. So you'd have two fans on the front, then two on the CPU cooler, and that would just be sucking air out the back naturally. But since I had the Corsair AF120 Elite fans, I thought it might be fun and more logical to swap out the standard NZXT fans that are included and use much better, more powerful and nicer looking fans from Corsair. They are, however, 120mm, and as you'll see, it leaves kind of a gap in the case at the front anyway, as you can see. Now, they are 120, the same as the standard fans, but you could fit 140mm fans on here, and I think that would probably be a bit nicer and it would make the case look a bit smarter. So that's something to bear in mind if you're thinking about copying this build. But the end result, as I'll show you at the end of the video, isn't too bad. I'm going to do some thermal tests and show the performance of that with benchmarking to demonstrate how it still works really well with this setup. Now, one of the reasons I've done this is I'm of the opinion that front mounting a radiator isn't really a great idea, which is why I did the push-pull setup on it in the first place, because I feel like you're restricting the airflow a bit by having the air having to force through the radiator before it gets into the case. In this setup instead, I'm pulling a lot more cold air in through the front. I'm still only using two fans versus the four naturally that were on the radiator, but there's nothing obstructing the airflow. These are very much designed for high airflow as well, with vortex vanes, and another design was basically pulling in as much cold air as possible through the front of the case and into the machine. So that's obviously beneficial. And we're making the most of that airflow front with all the holes in it and other things. So I think this is actually a more logical build, but we'll see at the end how the benchmarks compare and how the temperatures compare versus what I did originally with that push-pull setup. Ever so slightly different specs, so it's worth keeping that in mind before we get to that point. But I think this is a more logical way of doing it. It is, however, if you want to do a all-in-one cooler, probably the most logical thing to do with a 240 on the front, because yes, you could fit a 120mm radiator on the rear or on the top, but is a 120mm radiator really enough for a CPU cooler? Not too sure. So this case is kind of limited in your options really, unless you're going for a tower cooler. And I think what I'm doing here and the end result of what you'll see is actually possibly the most logical and also one of the most affordable ways you could set up this case, because you're basically adding in a few extra fans and then obviously the CPU tower cooler, which has fans on it as well. And it's a bit more straightforward because you can do the tower build outside of the case. Now, as I said, I've done a video separately on that cooler and how to set it up and the different things in there. And the logic of that, I've also gone into a lot more depth on this case. So if you want to find out the full build process, be sure to check out the link in the description to the original video if you've not seen it already. So what I've done is I've set up the front 2 fans to pull air in, and then that rear one to exhaust it. So the air will flow through this way. Now I've been asked this question a few times, which way does air flow through the fans? And it's always the front pulls the air in and then it goes out through the back. So just for demonstration purposes, with this air blower, I'm blowing air through the front of the fan and then out the rear, and you can see just the paper flaps around. You could obviously achieve the same logic by turning the PC on when it's finished and putting a bit of paper at the rear to see what happens, whether it gets sucked towards it or not. But this is always the logic. The front of the fans is where the air comes in through, and then the rear is where it exhausts out. So this is where you want to set it up. This is how I want to do it. Maybe pulling cold air in through the front, and obviously over the CPU tower cooler, and also obviously over the GPU as well. And then the hot air will naturally rise, and it will leak out of the top where there could potentially be another fan. But I'm going to tell you the reasons why I didn't do that at the end of this video. Now for this build, I'm also using a Rog Strix 850 watt power supply unit. It's a white one that I purchased on Amazon especially for this build. But I will also be removing it from this case and using it in a future build as well. I've got a lot of case builds coming up. I'm going to be doing a lot of different PC builds in the next few months. So I need a spare power supply unit that I'll be moving around. And I'll talk about why I'm mentioning that later on. But as you can see, a mass of cables and other things to deal with. And I'm going to do a video separately on this PSU and how to set it up and the highlights of it a bit later on. But I just wanted to show you some quick snippets of it and what it's like. Interesting style to it. Obviously a modular power supply unit, and you have all the nice markings on both the cables and on the power supply of where things plug into. You will notice some ROG logos in various different places, and it actually comes with some extra magnetic ones and stickers as well that you can stick on to jazz up the look and feel of it a bit more, change the style of it. And you also notice there's a 0 decibel button at the back there, so you can actually make it run quieter if you want to as well. Nice looking power supply unit, and as I'm happy to report, runs nice and quiet along with the other fans as well. So the setup for this should be fairly straightforward. I'm not going to go into too much depth here, but you can see some of the labeling for the power supply unit there and what cables you plug in. I only really need a few because I need the 24 pin for the motherboard. We have one 8-pin CPU connector, one 4-pin CPU power connector, and then a PCIe connector for the GPU, and a SATA power for a SSD, which I'll be showing you how to mount in a minute. But I don't have any fan controllers or any other peripherals really for the most part. And the 3060 graphics card that I'm using only uses one PCIe connector. So really straightforward, just plugging in what we need. And that's the joy of a modular power supply unit, that you only need to plug in the cables that you actually require, which means that cable management's a lot easier. And that's one of the things that I like about this case anyway, is that even with quite a few cables in it, there's actually quite a lot of room in there, especially if you're not using the hard disk drives and the trays down the bottom for that. But I actually found with an 850 watt power supply unit like this, it's fairly easy to fit it in and work around it, as you'll see in a second, or as you will have seen in the original video if you watched it. So this power supply unit pulls cold air in from the bottom of the case and then exhausts hot air through the rear. And there's some nice venting at the bottom of the case for this, but as you can see when I'm installing it, there's quite a lot of room at the front of it. I do find, however, that it is worth putting your power cables in first beforehand, because obviously you can see all the labeling is, it's just a little bit less fussy to mess around with trying to get your hand in there and plug cables in once it's installed. Then we use those flat head screws to screw the power supply unit into place. Now, I will note a few things. As I said, I'm going to be using this power supply in future builds, so you'll have to excuse some of the cable management a bit later on, because I'm purposely not going to cable tie this PSU in with all its different cables. So this won't be the neatest build, but actually I find this beneficial because it will show you just how good the rear of this case is in order to deal with cabling. So if you're terrible at cable management, much like I am, then you won't need to worry because it does all nicely fit in there. So we're basically just screwing those 4 screws into place to hold this PSU in there, and then we're arranging the cables. So as I said, I have one 8-pin CPU power connector and one 4-pin. You can see these nice ones are nicely split. They're also labeled CPU. We're basically going to run them up to the top. Now these are individually sleeved, as you can see, but they don't come with anything particularly to hold the cables together. So it was quite a faff and a fiddle with these power cables in order to get them in the right position. They do, however, have a number of Velcro ties in them, and as I've said in previous build videos, I wouldn't recommend using plastic cable ties until you're finished and everything's plugged in and connected up. So these are nice temporary stopgap to keep your cables tidy and to make sure everything's nice and neat, so you don't end up in a position where you've tied down your cables and then you can't get your PC to power on because something's not connected, so you have to undo everything and reposition it. So now I'm just putting the cables in temporarily using the various different ties and positioning them up so they're ready to connect up to the motherboard. The other thing that I've done, I think is worth talking about, is I've also bought myself an SSD. So I don't generally use 2.5-inch SSDs anymore. I either use full-size hard disk drives, massive things with loads of storage on them for my videos, or I use NVMe drives. But I've purchased a small Kingston drive, which is 120 gigabyte, just for demoing how you install SSDs in various cases. So you're going to see this Kingston drive appearing at all sorts of build videos in future if you stick around and watch. If you're interested in watching my videos, this drive will be used and multiple times. It is a very tiny drive. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using a 120 gigabyte drive, but I just want to be able to have something on hand that I can easily demonstrate and wouldn't just be a waste of money for me. So here you can see basically setting it into the case. You basically connect it up to this little adapter in the rear. It pops in with some little connectors on the back and then screws down into place. I've obviously connected up the SATA power as well, and then the data cable, just to be able to demonstrate how to do that and where those things go. I'm going to use those clips for the power supply unit video as well, so I can talk about where cables plug in. If you're curious and you don't know already how to connect up your power supply cables, I will be doing a video in more depth on that. Now I'm putting the NZXT N7Z590 motherboard in place. This is a nice motherboard that I've done a video on separately, which as you can see has some nice shielding over the front of it. And it also works really well with this black and white case because it has some black and white parts to it. And I've got a very clinical looking theme going on here. Some people might hate this, but I actually quite like it. Although once you've got the quite black glass on the front, which is kind of tinted glass side panel, you can't really see very much of this. So some of that's hidden away. That's not a problem. It's kind of a stealth build. It's all right. As you can see, when trying to put the motherboard in place, I had a problem with that rear fan cable getting in the way of the I/O shield. So that's worth bearing in mind. The other issue I had with this motherboard, which I mentioned in the review, is that the motherboard screws in the other case that I used it in had a real problem getting in through the holes on the front fascia, so the protective shielding. The holes aren't quite big enough to fit some motherboard screws through. That's not a problem with this case because the screws are ever so slightly smaller, so they will fit through the motherboard, and that was fine. The power supply unit cables for the top of the motherboard, however, are a fiddle, and again, this is my fault because the deep cool tower cooler probably should have been one of the last things I installed, but I thought it was easier to install it on the motherboard before I put it into the case. And now you can see that I've now got to struggle with my hand trying to get these power cables in. One thing of note as well is I could have installed a 120mm fan on the top, but the reason I didn't do that is because I thought it would cause airflow problems. So if you think about it, the front air coming in through the front and then going straight through the CPU cooler and then exhausting out the back. If I put one on the top, that would be pulling air up through the CPU cooler as well as through the back of it. So it might have been problematic. So that's the reason I've not done it. Also, it gives me a bit more space at the top to work with cables. Now I'm plugging in the 24-pin power supply unit cable on the right-hand side, and you can see me trying to negotiate these cables to make them a little bit tidier. Unfortunately, there's no sort of teeth included in here. There's no bracket to sort of separate these cables out, so you have to do it by hand. It's a little bit fiddly. It ends up looking a little bit messy. I'm not that happy with it, but as I said, I'm going to be taking it out anyway. If you're particularly fussy about it and you've bought this power supply yourself, you're just going to have to fiddle around with it and try and make it neat, which I think will be a pain. Some plastic ties at the back will probably sort it out though. Then we have the front panel USB connection, which is actually at the top of the case on this case. And that plugs in just underneath that. As you can see, I have a little bit of trouble with it. It was being a bit fiddly for some reason. But basically that connects up there. And then the fatter one, that's the USB-A connections. And on this motherboard, it slides into the side, which means I have to sort of fight with the cable hiding bracket. One of the things that I did with the previous build was actually remove this bracket so I could fit the radiator in there. In this case, in this build, now I don't need to do that. So it actually hides everything away quite nicely. Now for the front two fans, I'm using these two system fan headers here. I actually started by running the cables through and underneath behind that bracket and then plug them in there. But what I found was that it ended up with a little bit of extra cabling that was sort of sticking out from behind the bracket, and it didn't look very nice. As you can see, a little bit of that here. So what I ended up doing was actually unplugging them, running them across the back a bit more, up through the top near the RGB connectors on the motherboard, and then plugging them in from above instead. So this ends up with a little bit less cable visible, which is ideal. As I said, actually, it doesn't really matter because once the tinted glass panel's on, you can't really see them anyway. But I'm just trying to make things as neat as I possibly can to some degree. And also just to demonstrate where things plug in. So I have these two front fans plugged in here, and then obviously there's the other system fan header we need to plug in at the bottom. The two fans from the CPU tower cooler are plugged into the CPU fan header with a Y-splitter cable, which I've demonstrated separately on the other videos. So if you want to find out more, be sure to check those out. Then I'm running the HD audio and front panel connections into the bottom of the case because they're going to connect up with the motherboard. And then as you can see, just tucking away other cables that I might get in the way. One of the things I did find is some of the cabling from CPU cooler that I'd run to the back got a bit messy. And as you can see, it's not particularly neat back here. I have again tried to tidy things up with the Velcro ties, and I could use plastic ties, but that would then mean I'd have to cut them and avoid trying to cut the cables when I end up taking things back out again. But now I'm plugging in the SSD cable, so the data cable connects on the right hand side. There's only 4 ports on this motherboard, and then the HD audio, which plugs in on the far left of the motherboard, and the front panel connections, which plugs in on the right hand side. I've shown this in a bit more depth in the motherboard video if you're not quite sure where things plug in, but basically just demonstrating the various different steps for this. This is kind of a behind the scenes look at the logic of how I'm doing things. I thought it'd be worth, in some instances, and I've done this a few times now, revisiting various cases and trying different layouts. I've already done this for the Corsair 4000D, for example, which I also used a radiator in originally and then went to an all air build with Noctua fans, and then I did the 4000D QL edition with RGB fans. Now I'm trying out the NZXT Flow and focusing more on air. This is a more affordable build, hopefully, by the end of it, and a NZXT mostly themed one, apart from the deep cool CPU cooler. Obviously, we've got an NZXT motherboard. NZXT might have enjoyed it if I'd used their power supply unit as well. But there's a lot of white going on here. And here you can see just a little touch of the RGB lighting eking out from underneath the tower cooler. So I've got RGB RAM. For some reason I thought that was a sensible purchase, but then I put a CPU tower cooler over the top of it. And one of the things I found weirdly with this case, I don't remember being a problem with the other case, is that I had a real problem removing the GPU brackets at the rear of the case. They were screwed in really, really tight, and I had to get an even bigger screwdriver in order to remove them. There was also this extra plate that was being held in place and stopping me installing the GPU. But one of the other things that I have done this time that you'll see in a second is I've run the PCIe cables into the bottom, and then you can just basically tug them up. So I actually end up thinking that this build looks a little bit nicer. This is obviously a personal opinion. You might have thought the original one looked nicer with the RGB, and actually some of that RGB lighting was a bit nicer, and it did sort of set the case off in a different way. But now you're seeing the different options of what you could do potentially, and you can see there is still space at the top for the 120mm fan, and you can also see a bit more of the gap that I was talking about at the front. So now I've finished. Here's my cable shame at the rear, and I do this on purpose now, not only because I'm going to remove this stuff, but also because I want to demonstrate how, if you're a messy builder, it doesn't really matter with this case terrible amount, because you can basically just put the door on, click it into place, and screw the thumb screws down. And it didn't cause me any problems. It wasn't pushing back against the door. It wasn't fighting me. I ended up being able to just shut this up and close it away, and my shame is now hidden. So if you have cable shame as well, don't worry about it. No one's going to know. It's a good case for hiding it, although you can see it poking out the bottom a little bit there. But here you can see the end result of my efforts and what that looks like. So quite a bit different from the original one that you would have seen at the beginning. And as I said, again, you can see that gap at the top of the front where the two 120mm fans are Two 140mm fans would look a little bit nicer there, or perhaps I could have shifted them up a little bit to fill in some of that gap. They might have also been better positioned to blow air directly into the CPU cooler as well if I'd done that. I still think it looks really nice though, and once you've got the front panel on, you won't really notice either. So the setup there is pretty awesome. So you can see here when I put that panel back on, now it's all kind of hidden away. And this is one of the things that I noted when I did the RGB build as well, as when the panel was on, you couldn't really see the RGB lighting very much through there. And then when you put the tinted glass side panel on, it hides things away even more. So you can see now it's very dark, and this is also under heavy lighting, obviously in a well-lit studio area where I'm recording. If you were in a dark room, you will definitely have a stealthy build here, even with those white peripherals and parts on the inside. So hopefully this has been an interesting look at the case. Stick with me in a second because I'm going to talk about the thermal performance and the difference between the original build with the all-in-one cooler. Now, it's important to take the following with a pinch of salt because your experience may vary, and also this was tested on 2 different days, different temperatures potentially in the room. But what I've done is I've run Cinebench R23 and Heaven Benchmark on this setup. Now, I did the same thing when I had the push-pull setup with the different CPU and different cooler in the original H510 Flow. So in that one, I was only using a Core i5 11600K. In this one, I'm only using an 11700K, an i7. So obviously a more powerful CPU and a bit more intensive. However, I'm now using a tower cooler versus what was previously an all-in-one cooler with push-pull setup on it. Originally, I found that I was getting about 62 to 65 degrees max temperature on the package in that previous setup with the Core i5, so pretty cool. And now I'm getting about 75 degrees, so you can see about 10 degrees warmer. But again, this is a different CPU. I actually found that it ran really quietly as well at this temperature, and this is actually a really good temp for this amount of pressure because running Heaven, recording with OBS, and also running Cinebench all at the same time is quite a lot of pressure to be putting the thing under. Now, it's worth noting that with this same tower cooler in the deep cool case that I did a video on previously, I got around 77 degrees, so it was actually hotter in that case. In that case, I had 3 fans on the front instead of 2. There was only a very small, negligible difference in that though, so that is worth bearing that in mind. Very small amount of difference, but what the point of this is actually very effective cooling in a quiet case, because with the AF120 Elite ends up being quite quiet. You'll also note if we scroll down a bit further in the hardware monitor that you can see we get about 73 degrees max on the GPU, 87 max on the hotspot, which again is comparable to what I had in the deep cool case as well. So basically similar results on exactly the same spec, because that was the same spec in the deep cool case, except I had different fans and obviously a different case setup. But the results here are good enough. And I think the result is that actually, yes, this has worked quite well. It's quiet, it runs really well, it looks nice, it was easy to put together because there's no RGB cables to mess around with. So the end result has been pretty fantastic and I'm really happy with it. So if you've made it this far in the video and you've enjoyed it, then please smash that subscribe button. Also, I'd like to take the time now to give a special shout out to my ever awesome YouTube members. And that's Spawns-A-Lot, Meaty Keyboard, Beast Bunny, JShank007, Raw483, Starastins, McFarty, Rigsy79, Chief Howe, Aaron Yardin, Garrett Revere, and Derek Townsend. All those awesome people are donating a small amount each month to help support the channel, and it's really appreciated because they're helping me do crazy things like building PCs over and over and over again for your enjoyment and hopefully for useful shenanigans for yourself. So consider clicking that join button yourself to see the benefits of being a member. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.